Welcome. I'm really pleased to be bringing in my guest of this month, Amy Pickett-Williams, a specialist in grief and how it is that grief can bring us all together. It's a common human feeling. And what more, she's going to give you some of the tools in how to move through your grief. Allow your heart to listen. I'm really honoured in this interview to be sharing space with Amy Pickett-Williams, who is she has a multitude of wonderful gifts, I feel, to this world through her professional and personal story, which we're going to discover more of. And so I'm just going to start by saying welcome, Amy. It's a real honour to have this time with you and to be sharing your story and the gifts that you're bringing to the world at this time. And I'd love it if you could introduce a bit about yourself and maybe a little bit about the story behind the Light Movement and where that originated from within you.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me on your beautiful podcast. So my story, I started out being a grief psychotherapist many years ago. Actually, it's my 25th anniversary. And my heart song has always been working with families who experienced the death of a child, but it's morphed throughout the years into many different types of loss, including, death of a parent and death of a sibling, death of a pet. And then other areas of loss, such as infertility and loss of a sense of safety or peace, loss of relationship. I learned over the years being a grief therapist that it really impacts all of us at all different times of our lives. And it's the one thing none of us are immune from. So I fell in love with doing this work after being a patient in the hospital, and I happened to be on the oncology unit, even though at that time it was not a cancer diagnosis. And I fell in love with the ability to connect with people in that humble and intimate space. And then from there, I grew into working into a low-income clinic, working with people experiencing all different types of loss and trauma. And obviously, there's always grief and trauma. And then started a private practice. And along my journey, my dad, who was a very, very important person in my life, he was an education lawyer, and he spoke nationally in the United States on preventing school violence and mandated reporting, which is child abuse reporting. And his last big hurrah before he died was to ensure transgender youth had a safe place to use public restrooms in schools. And he would always gently, even though he was this giant of a man, over 6'5", and very had the ability to present in many different conferences and was a very known person. He was also a very humble person. And he would always gently say to me, Amy, you need to speak to your work with the death and the dying and the grief and the loss. And I'd say, Dad, I'm a psychotherapist. I'm not a public speaker, but thank you. But it always held on to that because I thought, he's such a humble guy. You don't have to be this, narcissist full of yourself person to be able to speak and make a difference because he embodied that. And so gradually he would continue to say it over and over again. I said, Dad, I just love my private practice or, working in a hospital. And before that, and then tragically in October of 2020, we were camping, and we did a lot of camping during COVID because our youngest son had some very, very severe health issues. So we had to be more cautious than others. And as he was returning his RV with my mom, he went to close a gate, and a gust of wind knocked over that gate, knocked him over, and he ended up with a brain bleed. And after 2 days, we had to withdraw life support. And it was hard. It was hard. And our children really, really struggled. My oldest was very connected to him. And it was a hard, hard time. So I professionally experienced so much loss in my life, and personally too, little things or big things, such as, loss of a job or, moving and bigger things like miscarriages. But and pets, but this one was a very profound thing for me. And so we slowly gathered the pieces. And then, sure enough, life started to get back to normal. Our youngest son got vaccinated with COVID. And so we were able to send our 3 kids back to school, and life was getting back to some normalcy. And my husband and I finally got some time away. And it was last year, so March of 2023. We went away to Ojo Caliente, which are these hot springs outside Taos, New Mexico. And we were enjoying the hot springs. And my husband, who's this big, intense mountaineer, climber, he's like, let's go for a hike. And I was like, sure, let's go for a hike. So we went up this very steep mesa. And I commented to my husband on the way, I said, this is really steep. And I love hiking, but I am not the type of hiker he is. And but we made it to the top. And we visited this beautiful mica mine that was like shimmering diamonds. It was so beautiful. And then the time came for us to come back down. So on our way down the path, there was this very steep section, and there was this juniper tree that was strutting out in the middle of the path. And I grabbed onto the juniper tree and I held onto it. I hugged it, being the vegan hippie that I am. And my husband said, I'm sure it's helped people too. He's not a vegan. He's not a hippie. I love him still. And I hold on to the tree and hug the tree, and we start going back down. And I said, I know that tree has saved a lot of people. So we keep going down. The last section is the steepest part of the path. My husband said to me, do you want me to lead? And I said, no, it's my birthday. I will lead this path. And I started down, and unfortunately, I tripped and I stumbled and I fell. I fell over 40 feet. 600 cactus vines, at least 600 cactus vines. I ended up with a fractured tibia. I ended up with a severe concussion. At the time, the only thing I remember about that fall was as I was falling, I hit my head very hard, and this flash of what happened to my dad hit. And it was like, please don't let this be like my dad. And so finally, eventually I stopped. I don't remember much about it. Somehow my husband's adrenaline and his rock climbing, mountaineering skills got down to me. But I should have fallen 100 feet. I only fell 40, which is still a lot, but I should have fallen 100 feet. And do you know what stopped me?
Juniper berry tree.
Another juniper tree. Yes. So it is my spirit tree. And I don't actually have a tattoo on my body, but I will eventually have a tattoo somewhere on my body of a juniper tree. And so it stopped. My husband gathered me in my adrenaline. We got down the rest of the mesa, down to the path. And I said, just pull the spines out of me. It was adrenaline talking, right? And he said, no, we have to go to the hospital. And the staff at the hot springs said, I think you should get an ambulance. I said, no, I'm good. So we drove. We got to the hospital. Long story short, they pull out some cactus spines. They tell me, Amy, you're going to be pulling out cactus spines for the next year. And they checked to make sure I did not have a brain bleed, and I did not. So that was when we called my mom and our kids and said, Mom's had a big accident, but I'm going to be okay. And they eventually discharged me. And my husband went to get our car, and he got the car and went, and I was waiting for him in the waiting room. He came back in, and I'd fully passed out again, like I had before. My eyes were fully dilated. My husband thought I died twice. They readmitted me, and this time they thought maybe I had a belly bleed. I did not have a belly bleed, but it turns out I had a mass. And they said, you need to get back to Denver, which is where we live, and check out the mass in your belly. And it turned out I had cancer. So guess what? The juniper tree saved my life twice. Some people might say the fall saved my life, but I personally like to think of it as the spirit tree that saved my life. So we get back. They removed about third to half of my kidney, and during my recovery, my dad's voice came back to me over and over again, and it said, "Amy, this is your time. This is your time." And I love being a psychotherapist, but I felt called to do more. And so in September of last year, a group of volunteers and I put together a solstice event, and September is significant because in September we started planning it and we said, let's have faith representatives from as many different faiths come together to support people. And I'll offer a somatic talk because I've been so connected to the somatic work, which I'll go into in just a minute, that whole mind-body connection. And so I did this talk. And the reason why it's significant is because it was right before the horror of Israel and Gaza Strip happened. And so the beauty of this event is we were able to bring rabbis together and Muslim representatives together and Buddhists together and Native Americans together and Christians together and come together to stand in solidarity for all people and all types of grief. So we did this beautiful event. We had about 500 people tune in virtually, including from England and other countries. And then we had people come in person, about 200. And it was an amazing event. And my dad's voice said, "You're not done." And so we gathered the volunteers. And then just in the last few months, we formed a nonprofit. And the nonprofit is called the Light Movement, which stands for Love and Grief Held Together. We always experience love with grief, and we experience grief with love. And the held together fits with love and grief, but it also fits almost more significantly as we have to hold each other together. We all experience loss. We all experience grief. And our world is isolating and is experiencing loneliness so much. We have to come together. So we formed a goal, 4 goals. The first was to remind people they were not alone in their grief. The second was to teach somatic-based tools, mind-body connection, or some people might think of mind-body, spirit, or soul connection, in order to integrate our experiences, our lost experiences, to find purpose and meaning. Our third goal was to connect with other resources. And so in that event of the solstice, we brought many nonprofits together because, there are different support groups and different agencies that can help people in their grief and their loss. And the fourth one, which was very, very important to me, was to stand in solidarity for all people and all types of grief. Death, dying, infertility, health. There's so many areas.
Thank you, Amy. That's an amazing story. And it's the thing that really resonates with me instantly, and it brought tears to my eyes, was when you were saying about your dad and his message to you to give this a voice. And even now, wow, it's so powerful, is that connection, and to step out, of your kind of introverted personality, right? And to be really seen and to be really heard, because it is such a powerful message and it is really important at this time. And I really resonate also in terms of the connection between grief and then jumping into fear and anger, right? When we don't really let ourselves process grief in the body. And so I'd love to look at the somatic, kind of what somatic means, and you've already touched on it. And I think, a lot of people who listen to my podcast will have a sense of, it's allowing the mind and the body to talk to each other and to have that connection and that relationship. And so I would ask you if, in your experience, you've got more of a seeing that connection between the somatic experience where grief creates real anger and, the kind of the feelings that come from anger, because I feel like we're seeing that a lot and it can trip people up, right? Because when we're angry or it's unfair, it's, whatever the kind of the alternative word is to anger, because obviously anger can be experienced in more subtle ways. And I think many of us don't realize we're in anger when we're feeling it, as to how that can stop us then from moving through grief.
It's a really good question. And I think where we have to start is, what does anger feel like in our body? What do we notice? Usually when we're angry, we tighten up. And there's so many people that don't check in with their body, right? And so when I have a therapy client that comes in very angry because of the injustice of what they've experienced or the incredible trauma that they've experienced, and they come in just tight, I'll just say, I'll notice your body is so tight right now. And I notice you're hardly breathing. it must be so difficult. And a lot of times, I think so many of us in this world aren't in touch with that, right? Like, oh, yes.
Mm.
And so if we can get in touch with those sensations in our body, we can then begin to work with our body to be able to work with those emotions of anger. And so much of the time, I work with kids too. And with anger, so much of the time we talk about the volcano, and the lava is the volcano. It's what's fueling but what is fueling the lava, right? And so much of the time it's fear and it's sadness and it's confusion.
Yeah.
And so then we get in touch with those feelings. If they come in as anger, we get in touch with those and we talk about, what does that feel like in your body? What is that like for you? We have to start there before we can even begin to start the tools to support people somatically in their journeys.
Beautiful, beautiful. And when you tap into the fear that's underneath that kind of that I guess fire energy, as it were, because the volcano really reflects that fiery, heated kind of eruptive energy that we may not feel as eruptive, right? We might be so fearful of our own eruptive potential, right, that we suppress it, and we've learned to suppress it. And obviously there's many people who are brought up, that anger is not something we should express, and so it gets eked out kind of in other ways in our experience. And so it can come through, you mentioned fear kind of often being underneath that. So what other ways do you see that coming through people's, like, somatically, and how they express that when they come to see you?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question too. I mean, a lot of times it's that like intense and nervousness, right? And they're in that. I'm also a yoga teacher. We call that rajasic place, right? Where we're in that amped up sympathetic state. And so it's so important to be able to meet that mood. I have three huge mentors, and Amy Weintraub is one of them. And she speaks a lot to that in her writings of like, you have to meet where that person is at. So if someone is like shaking, right, or they're breathing rapidly, right, I'm not going to say, you know what, let's lie down and do a little meditation, And so instead, I'll say, wow, you know what, my office is right by a park. Let's walk, right, and then eventually get to that place, right. Versus the opposite, right? I may have a client that comes in that just is almost in that immobilization place, what we call dorsal phase in polyvagal theory. And so where maybe they're in a dissociative state, or they're just almost dead to the world, right? And so that would be someone where I'd be like, if I said, let's go for a walk, they'd say, you're fired as my therapist, right? And instead I'd say, maybe we could just start out sitting here and maybe just do a few breaths.
Beautiful, beautiful.
Maybe we do a meditation, a yoga nidra, right? When you're in that place.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I think it's so important that you meet clients where they're at. You meet people where they're at to be able to support them in getting in touch with their body sensations, the emotions that are underneath those sensations that are stimulating those sensations. And then you start working with the tools like the vagus nerve and other body sensations.
Yeah. Beautiful. Thank you, Amy. That's really lovely. And I hopefully, I love it when people can start to understand this for themselves, right? And they can start to recognize that although they might be feeling exhausted, it's also because they're in a sympathetic nervous system state, right? And so they're actually really agitated. And although they feel exhausted, they're not going to be able to rest until they've dealt with that energy. Like you say, like go for a walk, do the activity. The same as if they're constantly feeling flat. It's different from exhausted, but you're hyper vigilant, and you're really, really switched on. When you're shut down in that freeze or fawn state, you need those gentler techniques to kind of help lift you back up and out. And that to me is one of the key things that I think so many people, they're scared to connect because they don't know what to do with it once they're connected, right? And it's giving them the tools and a very simple, accessible way to access those tools in order to help them move through. And I guess we've already kind of started talking about the science and the nervous system in this conversation, and kind of, tapped into vagus nerve, polyvagal theory, which is quite complicated. And and can be quite hard for someone to get their head around, I think, initially. And so what would be your kind of little umbrella way of explaining it to someone, given it would be lovely for us to be able to let them have that little bit of empowerment through hearing this conversation?
I would love to. So what I say to a lot of times to my therapy clients in all these years is, when someone comes in to start working with me, they may start out, we call it a window of tolerance, and it might be the size of an attic window. I always tease clients that I wish I had 4 hands when I'm explaining this. And so their window might be this big. And so they go outside their window to that sympathetic state where they're just like, they're in that angry, agitated, anxious state constantly, right? Or they're in that immobilization, I cannot move state, that hypoarousal state. And so they're doing this roller coaster. So again, this is why I wish I had 4 hands. They're doing this roller coaster over up and down, up and down. And so part of our work and part of the theory of all of this with polyvagal theory and window of tolerance is not only teaching these clients and everyone how to get back into the window, but also what are the tools we can utilize to expand our window? So it's not the size of an attic, but it's more the size of like a sliding glass door, right? And so that when we ride these waves of grief, we're not jumping way out or way below. And so these tools and the support, so once the client understands the science, we teach these tools and they say, oh, I think my window is expanding. It's not to say that the grief is going away. And I think that is so important. And probably one of my biggest messages that I really want to get out there in this world is that we don't necessarily heal from grief. We learn to grow with our grief. We learn that the wound will always be there in that tree or that cactus, but with this tender care and these supportive somatic practices, hopefully our cactus will continue to grow, even though the wound will always be there. But hopefully I won't be poked again.
Beautiful. Yes, I hope that you're not poked by a cactus again too. I really do. There's enough once with 60 cactus plants attacking you.
600.
600. And so when it comes to grief, slightly different from trauma, what do you see is the difference with the nervous system, maybe, as opposed to trauma? Because they are slightly, they're similar, but they're not the same necessarily.
Yeah. And I think it more goes back to that space of, all trauma has grief, but not all grief has trauma. Mm. So when you experience trauma, like when my dad died, that was trauma. It was very unexpected. Did not think he was going to die, right? My nervous system was reacting in a traumatic nervous system state. And so there's times though with grief that maybe our nervous system doesn't react as much. And so these tools can be really helpful, but maybe we're not going outside our window so much with that grief experience. We're still feeling a lot of feelings, and I'm not negating that. They're both, grief is hard, whether there's a traumatic response to it or not. It is hard, right? With the traumatic piece, though, it's learning more about how do we get back into that window. And it's much harder to get back into that window.
Beautiful. Can I offer my personal experiences? And they're kind of two slightly different ones. One would be when my grandfather died, who I was very, very close to. It's like the little version of him, and he was my idol as a child. And so I knew it was his time, and it wasn't unexpected. And so when he passed, I actually, although I was sad to lose him, I was also really happy that he had had such a good life and that he'd done so many wonderful things in the world. He was a minister and he'd helped a lot of homeless people and drug addicts in his life. And so I was just really fulfilled by his life. And so again, like you say, like there wasn't any trauma for me. I could feel my sadness, but I could hold my mum in losing her father, but I didn't have that trauma with it because it wasn't a surprise. There was nothing in there for me other than just my sadness and my missing him and my gratitude, which could make it a lot easier. But he also used to talk about how we have endless chapters in life where we have to get to know our new self. And with that, we say goodbye to the old self. And I always found that really helpful for me when I had like my brain injury, and it was that sense of recognizing that life that I'd been living had gone. But I was also in a trauma response because I'd had an accident and my body had been through a physical trauma, and it was very traumatizing losing that career. And so learning to get myself back into a better nervous system regulation was a key part of me being able to cope and understand with letting go of myself and what I was losing. You know, it was like that two-part. I could see the grief of what I was letting go of, but I also had to do it within a window of tolerance of, you know, and I had to recognize, okay, I feel worse symptoms if I let myself cry about this loss for too long. So I'm going to give myself this much time so that I'm allowed and I have permission to feel it, but I won't make myself feel more ill and struggle, right? And that was what my nervous system could cope with. And so I was giving myself my little windows of tolerance as I learned to rebuild my ability to cope with emotions. And so that would be the difference for me, I guess, in trauma and grief on its own. And trauma with grief was like understanding those windows of tolerance and giving myself little tasks, right, as I did deal with the grief and the trauma at the same time. And so we have to be more conscious, I guess, when there's grief and trauma mixed together.
Yes. Those are two wonderful and hard examples that you went through. But it's a beautiful way to connect the two. Absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. I think it's sometimes, you know, we don't recognize, right, that we have a trauma. And, you know, I know that they're differentiated sometimes, little t and big T kind of traumas, right? You know, of what we have in our lives, that sometimes we don't identify the trauma. And we really need to see that even with things like nervous breakdowns. I think we can see that quite often. There's there's lots of little traumas in there that need to be supported. With the grief of our perception, we're, I don't know, invincible, and maybe we're not. You know, and that would be a very simple trauma and grief cycle again. That I think is easy to miss, like you say. You know, there's all kinds of ways in which grief comes up. And so with the light movement, which I'm just so in awe of what you turned around last year, you know, it just goes to show the amount of support and energy that's coming through. And your dad is so right with his messages to you about the importance of this. What are the kind of tools that you're wanting to get out there now to support people? Because obviously you've talked about what you do with one-on-one clients and how you can educate and inform them, but what is the light movement bringing at a larger scale?
Yeah. So we, starting in the next few months, we'll probably have locally 4 or 5 classes, and then virtually, hopefully many more, where people can tune in. And classes are anything that's somatically based. So our ultimate hope is we get volunteers all over the world spreading light. So it could be a yoga teacher. It could be someone that likes to lead a walking meditation or a hike. It could be someone that likes to do art and teach people ways to paint and bit and touch intentionally with their bodies as they do that. It can be singing, chanting, right? There's so many, swimming, anything that's body-based, to be able to spread light to people, to know that there are tools when we work with our body and we intentionally recognize what we're doing with our body. You know, the swimming and the walking is that bilateral stimulation, getting both sides of the body going. So one is classes, which is huge. And we also have a social justice model where we are offering a training in October that anyone can attend. We have it deeply discounted for people that want to volunteer for light. And our hope is, for example, let's say someone in Africa takes it and they say, you know, I love what I learned and I want to morph it to what fits in my culture. Beautiful, right? Because that's our social justice lens. And so being able to morph it once they've learned some of the science and the tools is another big thing. We're doing a grief retreat as well here in Colorado that's open to anyone. But our hope is to also have volunteers start saying, I want to lead a somatic grief retreat somewhere, right? And that's our beauty too. And then our solstice event, we hope, I mean, it was so beautiful that we had like 700 people tune in. We hope we have thousands on December 21st tune in for that amazing connection of saying, I am here for you. I am here for me. We are doing this together.
Mm. I feel in all of that, I'm so excited by it, but I'm also really feeling that holding together piece. And I love the logo, the painting of like the hands coming together and the heart shape that they make. Um, and it reminds me of that sense of and again, this comes from my grandfather, that sense of like you would always be like you hold someone, right? But they also you hold others in the same way. And that's what the hands really reminded me of. And so in that holding together, one thing that comes to me is how sometimes people can get divisive in how to hold together. And so, and you know, especially as you said, it launched just before Gaza last year. And so have there been aspects of seeing how people can overcome where they feel like there's a divide, even though the grief is the same? Sometimes people don't, they get into competition or comparison of things, you know, and what would be your sense of how to ensure that togetherness really is held by people?
Yeah. I think it's so important to know that it's a universal experience. So even if we're on different sides on an issue, we both know what grief feels like. We both know what loss is. And so if we can meet people where they're at, of saying, I may not believe in the war that you started, and I know underneath all of that, there's a lot of grief. And so if we can hold that, I think we can work towards healing our world.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Yeah. Just seeing that common humanity that's beneath it. The one thing that really resonates for me is also like what true compassion is. You know, grief helps us touch into that common humanity, which is where we then have compassion, because we can see we don't need to know someone's story to know that they've suffered and that they felt pain. Right.
That's
and
right.
like you say, that grief is a common pain that everyone's experienced at some level at some point in their life.
And
we
all experience it.
Yeah, we do.
No one's immune.
No one is immune. And it's amazing that part of different people's ability to self-regulate through challenges. And I think that really does come down to that nervous system piece of kind of what someone's set up like biologically and what they've inherited through epigenetics that has them predisposed, I guess, to experiencing more trauma, to having more of a swing in their nervous system than other people, you know. And I do, and I'm sure you do, know people who things don't seem to touch them in the same way. They seem to just have that inbuilt resilience to process things, but also they also see that deep compassion that connects us all.
Yeah. And I think one little important caveat is sometimes we want to bypass our experiences, right? And so I think it's really important to note that if someone comes in and says, I'm fine, I'm good, I'm fine, right? Usually they don't do that in therapy. They're not fine. You know, they won't say that. But like, let's say, you know, a friend of mine, right? And a neighbor, and will say, I'm good. It's okay. You know, but it's important to note that we cannot bypass our experiences either. Right. But sometimes we have to find the place of safety and to be able to do it first. And we have to be able to feel that.
And also sometimes we're not in a situation where we can yet do that. We've got other things that we have to deal with first. And, you know, a bit like what you were saying, you know, with your father's passing and the timing of your kids being homeschooled, like, you know, there's also how much time you had and who could come in and support you. And sometimes like you don't get that time at that time to deal with it. Right. And so we get into compartmentalizing and recognizing, and that's different from those who have a good inbuilt resilience and do seem to process things in a healthy way. And so identifying the difference between when we need to compartmentalize, and that is what we're doing, and kind of saying like, I'm really going to stop and tend to this as soon as I can take a breath, but also not being someone who is procrastinating and never facing it as well.
Yeah.
Being really honest with
Yeah.
yourself if you're procrastinating.
I think one thing, if there's one thing that most every client that I've worked with, and as I shared, I've worked with many, many families who have experienced the death of a child. The one thing that they've held on to and have come back like years later and said is that 90-second rule. And I didn't know who came up with it, but I now know it was Dr. Jill Bolt Taylor. And the neurology of when we feel an intense, intense, intense experience and we allow ourselves to feel it, our brain will go about 90 seconds. It's that tsunami wave, and then it will dissipate. That's not to say that the next tsunami wave won't come back, but it's important to know that there is a reprieve between each tsunami wave. And eventually in the ocean, the waves calm. And then the storm will happen like a trigger and anniversary, right? But they come. And so my clients have always come back to me and said, I held on to that. When I had to feel it, I had to go in the bathroom because I couldn't hold it off anymore, or I couldn't compartmentalize it. It's about 90 seconds. And there's that beauty of the pause between the next wave, which is where our growth can happen, right? It's that Viktor Frankl quote, this between the stimulus and response, we find our freedom.
Wonderful.
And it's that same thing.
Thank you, Amy. Those are two really, really great grounded kind of pieces for people to take, and know that it is only 90 seconds. It does just pass. And I see it especially with breath work. People allow the emotion, it rises and then it's gone. And their perception of time might be that it was longer than the 90 seconds, but it really is so brief and it's so quick, and so much can move if we really allow ourselves to be fully aware with the body of what is happening. So it's so profound that so much can happen in so little time. And so what would be the best way for other people to get involved in the Light Movement? We've got the classes, the event in December. So obviously I'll pop the link and your contact info and socials beneath the podcast so people can follow you and get in touch. But yes, what would be your best suggestions?
The training would be beautiful if people can tune into the training. I don't know what time zones are, but that is a great option. And it's a way for our nonprofit to make a little bit of money. Right now, we're all volunteers, right? So it can bring in a little bit of money. And we desperately need to do that as we just got some of our insurance bills. So that's another way is, I never knew all the parts to a nonprofit. It's a beautiful thing. So, so if people are interested in doing our trainings, any of our virtual classes that we'll be building, the solstice event, I hope it would be such a beautiful thing if we had millions of people tuning in at that time. Obviously if people are interested in donating to our nonprofit, that would be beautiful as well. So we can continue to grow and make this mission global.
Yeah. Beautiful. Great. So everyone make sure you get that donation button going. I'm a big believer in donations. It really makes a difference. And it feels like such a surprising gift when someone leaves a donation. So, and definitely, it sounds like the trainings, I was checking them out. They look really amazing. You've got such a great faculty there who are all behind it with great experience. So it sounds really promising for anyone to get involved with, to really not only know and understand in yourself, but being able to lead and facilitate and support other people.
Yes, my three main mentors are doing it for free. The panel, Dr. Ariel Schwartz, Amy Weintraub, and Joanne Lutz. And I'm so honored that they're going to do a little Q&A on their books. And the beauty thing, because I am also humble, going back to my dad, the beautiful thing though is people are like, Amy, you have 25 years of expertise in this. You too will lead something beautiful. So I keep reminding myself of that.
You will. And as your voice keeps, coming out and finding its joy of being in larger groups, I'm sure you will find, what those parts are that you feel like teaching for yourself as well. But it's awesome to have the support of such a strong faculty behind you. And it shows just what a strong movement this really is. And I think that was always a really nice reaffirming thing for you as an individual to see what's holding you, a bit like holding onto your juniper tree, right? You've got that.
Yes. And an up and coming amazing yoga teacher and social worker who's my intern this year is also on it. I want to make sure I shout out to her, Allie McDonald. I'm so proud of her as well.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, beautiful. Good. Yeah. So check out below, guys. Make sure you sign up. And if it's not the right timing for you, pop in some donations and join the December event for sure, and share it with people. You know, we all know people who are struggling with grief. So please do share and connect with Amy and this really important movement. It's one of the only ways we're going to move up and out. And it's really not that scary to look at your grief. It's much scarier to stay in what you are facing every day than to face your grief. And so please do share and do look at your own grief, even if it seems teeny today. Thank you so much, Amy. It's been an absolute honor. I'm so excited for the light movement and for your work coming out into the world, and for your dad's message through you to share it is really, really going to come alive and feel it in the next couple of years. So thank you so much for your time and joining us today. And I'm sure we will see you another time in the future.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for joining. Have a wonderful day.